Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. German citizens went to the polls on Sunday for the fourth snap election in that nation's post-war history. Public opinion surveys indicated that the far-right party AfD, Alternative for Germany, was poised to play a larger political role than ever before. The party also has attracted significant attention from U.S. political leaders of late, including U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who, in addition to visiting a Holocaust concentration camp during a recent trip to Europe, also met with Alice Weidel, the head of Germany's AfD party. Here to discuss the outcome of the election, its impact on Germany's relationship with Israel, and the German Jewish community, is AJC Berlin Director Remko Leemhuis. Remko, welcome to People of the Pod.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
So if you could just brief our audience on who exactly AfD is, what their history is, and their ideology.
So the party started out in 2013 and started out as I don't want to make it a joke, but they started out as a sort of party of professors who were in opposition to the European austerity policy during the financial crisis, meaning especially keeping Greece, who was in a deep financial crisis, and they advocated for expelling Greece, for example, from the European Union because they were afraid that their debt will be then sort of distributed among all member states of the European. So that was their starting point, but that was also their only issue. And I remember that in 2015, they were around 3 to 4%. But then the party changed. We had, as many of your listeners know, the influx of over 1 million refugees from mostly Syria. And the party sort of reinvented itself. And from then on, migration policy, illegal migration, all of the issues connected to these issues were at the center. And from there, they rose and again, radicalized ever since. And right now, the migration issue is also their only, at least their central issue on which they are campaigning. And it doesn't matter what you ask. I've seen a lot of these debates that we have before elections with all the heads of the parties. And it is really astonishing how the party is always able to tie every single issue to migration, be it taxes. At the end, it's always about migration, illegal migration, and migrants. And that is something that is their central platform.
Well, the Trump administration also made illegal immigration central to its platform. But I think what AJC here in America found so alarming about Vance's meeting with Weidel, perhaps there was alarm there in Germany too, was the party's clear record of anti-Semitism and hostility to America. Weidel herself has called Germany a slave state to America and Germany's Holocaust remembrance culture a guilt cult. AJC pointed both of those things out after the vice president's meeting. So did AfD do as well as expected, Remko? What are the election results so far?
So we had the highest voter turnout since 1990. I guess we were above 80%, 83, 84%, which is the highest turnout since 1990. So the elections after reunification, the AfD was able to double their result in the last general election at around 10%. Now they came in with 20%. And just for comparison, the Social Democrats came in with 15, close to 16%. So this is something that should concern us very much. The Christian Democratic Union, so the German conservative center-right party, won the election, although not with that many votes as expected. So their aim was 30% plus X. They now have 28, 29%. But still, they are the strongest party. And given German tradition, the party with the most votes then forms the government and invites other parties to form a government.
And that means that Friedrich Merz is poised to be the next chancellor. Is that correct?
Yes, If he's able to form a government, yes. I mean, at this point, he still has to talk to one party, and this will be the Social Democrats, even though they lost almost 10% compared to previous elections. Together, they have a majority, and everything indicates that they will form the next government.
Is there a possibility that Alternative for Germany, or AfD, could be part of the coalition as well?
No, that has been ruled out by Friedrich Merz, given that he was ahead in the polls for at least over a year. He has ruled this out on numerous occasions. He has ruled it out last time yesterday in interviews. So there's no chance that the AfD will be part of a federal government.
So, is there any reason for concern given the trajectory of this election and given AfD's results in this election? They came in second, correct?
There's a lot of reason for concern because we can say, of course, this is a broader trend in Europe and in the Western world that you have the rise of this right-wing populist parties. But in Germany, after 1945, it's not the first time that we have right-wing extremist parties in parliament, state, or federal. But it was always sort of an unwritten rule or law that the more radical these parties become, the less votes they get. And at some point, they just disappear. And what is troubling with the AfD is that the more radical they become, the more votes they get. And this is something that is pretty hard to grapple with, and where I very honestly also don't have an answer why they are able to break with this rule, but this is very, very troubling, especially in light of the fact that is something that is well known to the German public, that the German domestic security services surveilling the AfD and classifying them as a case of suspected right-wing extremism, so the whole party, and three regional branches of this party officially confirmed by German domestic security as far right, which means that they are in opposition to liberal democracy. And this is something that, again, is very, very concerning.
Of course, AfD did not win. The Christian Democratic Union won. Could that victory have any impact on the special relationship between Germany and Israel? This is, of course, the return of the party of Angela Merkel, correct?
First of all, we have to get credit for the outgoing government coalition because since October 7th, this coalition has reliable ally of Israel. Of course, there were issues where there were differences, but in general, the outgoing coalition has stood by Israel's side, which was also recognized by Israel. And it is not just a talking point for Israeli diplomats when they say that Germany is Israel's second most important ally. And they have done it despite the fact that they had a lot of pressure from their respective voter bases, especially the Greens and the Social Democrats. So this is something where we really have to credit these parties. Now, the Christian Democratic Union, as you have mentioned, is the party of Angela Merkel, and she came up with the term of the Staatsräson, and that Israel's security is central to Germany's policy. I think there are areas where the relationship will even improve. And just to give you one example, we are talking today on Monday, the day after the election, and it's really astonishing. Friedrich Merz gave a press conference today, the first after the election yesterday, and really the first question was about his call that he had with the Israeli prime minister yesterday. And he stated very clearly that he has invited the Israeli prime minister to Germany and that he will find a way to make sure that the Israeli prime minister will be able to visit Germany without being arrested given the ICC warrant. Something that the outgoing coalition didn't say this clearly or said they will adhere to the ICC arrest warrant. So this is something that from our perspective is very positive. And also, I think that the military cooperation and the defense cooperation between Israel and Germany, all of that will not be, again, openly debated, but again, in the formats where they belong. So, in general, I would say the relations will improve, but this will not mean that also this government or the next government will only say and do what Israel wants. But I think in general, the trend and the relationship will be more positive and even improve.
So, what about relations with the United States? As I mentioned before, Vice President Vance met with one of the AfD leaders. Do you foresee that relationship changing significantly?
Well, first of all, I have to say Friedrich Merz is very committed to the transatlantic relationship. But yesterday, again, in a post election interview, he said something that I thought I would have never hear from him. But he said that we in Europe maybe have to grapple with the fact that the US will not be the sort of ally that it was before, and that we in Europe have to think about a situation where the US will only very little or not present at all in Europe, especially when it comes to war in Ukraine and the support for Ukraine. So even though he is very committed to the transatlantic relationship, given the recent developments, he has become also much more critical or looks much more concerned to Washington and what is happening and what is coming out of Washington.
In other words, he sees a bit of a destabilizing effect when it comes to transatlantic relations and security from the direction of the United States, not within Europe itself.
Yes, and that doesn't mean that he doesn't see the failures that Europe and Germany has made over the past years. And I think that's something we also as AJC try to highlight every time, that the Europeans and especially the Germans for decades haven't lived up to their commitments when it comes to defense spending. And 11 years ago now, after Russia annexed Ukraine and the NATO states agreed on the 2% goal, Germany hasn't met this. And a lot of other European countries that are member of NATO haven't met that 2% goal. And the discussion about this goes even, way back longer. I think it was even started with President George W. Bush, who always highlighted this issue, and that the Germans, the Europeans, have to do more. And especially the Germans, as the third largest economy in the world and the biggest economy in Europe, has to shoulder more responsibility, which means they have to spend more. So he's very aware of the fact of all these shortcomings, and he's very willing to fix that and to spend more money on defense if the US cuts its spending here, if the US withdraws troops from the European continent, and still being aware that even if Europe does its best, we will not be able to fill these gaps because we just don't have the resources or the infrastructure to do that. So we will still need the US no matter what. So he will need to find a line, sort of working with the US, where we can, and then looking at what can Europe do to become a bit more independent from the US in all of these questions.
So let's zoom in and talk about the impact of the rise of AfD on the German Jewish community. Has it given license to those who might otherwise keep anti Semitic attitudes to themselves?
So, in general, as I've said at the beginning, nothing of this is a big surprise. The AfD in the polls over the past year or so, I would say, fared around 20%. So the result yesterday wasn't a surprise. And it was also not a surprise because we have seen the AfD having even bigger successes in state elections. But of course, this is concerning. This is concerning because the AfD is also a symbol of polarization, and polarization that we see across the Western world in all democracies at this point, I think. And historically speaking, times of polarization have never been good times for the Jewish community. But I also have to say that the German Jewish community is also very aligned in how to deal with the AfD. And that means no Jewish organization speaks to the AfD. Every Jewish organization at some point in time has come out against the AfD. We as AJC have had numerous publications on highlighting the threat to democracy, and by that also to the Jewish community by the AfD. And the AfD so far hasn't been successful in using Jews or Israel or pretending to be Israel's biggest friend and the Jewish community's biggest friends. No one buys into that, and everyone can see through that, and everyone understands that this is performative at best.
Here in the United States, people of opposite political persuasions are honestly having a hard time facing each other. Those who voted for Kamala Harris, they see the speed with which Trump is enacting his campaign promises. They're having a hard time facing their neighbors who voted for him or who had yard signs up for him. People are organizing boycotts of businesses and CEOs who are aligning themselves with Trump. Is the same dynamic playing out on the ground in Berlin or Munich, for example? Do you see that kind of, as you said, the polarization? Does it play out on the very personal level? Can neighbors face each other?
Yes, we see that. I'm not sure if we see it to the extent that we see it in the US. But of course, we see that, and that political questions, political issues have become a dividing line among friends, among families, and that people stop talking to each other. And that is a very worrying trend that this happens. I mean, of course, there is a line or where I would say it is legitimate to say, I'm not going to discuss these issues. And I personally, and we as AJC don't talk to AfD for all the reasons we have talked about. There's nothing for us to discuss with them. But yes, I have to say that especially over the past weeks, we have seen an increase in this polarization and in this lack of unity. Everyone agrees that it is okay to fight and to fight about the issues and to have even hard debates on issues, and that this is part of democracy. And I guess we Germans also have to learn that more that democracy means also debating things and having hard debates about issues. But at least the last weeks have seen that it then ventures into contempt and to, denigration. And if you are not having this position, then you're automatically, on the other side, not even be talked to. And that you don't often run into people that have an opposing view because we all live in a bubble. And that, I guess, the only place where you encounter people with different opinions is social media. And I guess we can all agree that social media is for sure not the best place to debate controversial issues. We all have to come out of our bubbles, that even if we have political differences with other people, still see that there's much more that aligns us with most of these people. And that if one person doesn't exactly hold the same view as you on any given policy, doesn't mean that it is an inherently bad person, but still someone that isn't just inherently bad, but your neighbor, your co-worker. And I think that is the biggest challenge for all democratic societies in the West at this point.
Remko, thank you so very much for joining us and for explaining the outcome of this election and what it narrowly avoided.
Not narrowly, but one thing is clear, and I think that is much more what I'm thinking about, is that certain issues aren't addressed in a way that people feel they are addressed and they are taken serious. I mean, we just have to look to our neighbor Austria, where an openly right-wing extremist party is now the strongest party. And we should do everything we can to avoid this scenario. But that means then even have difficult debates and making also difficult decisions. But if we want the center to hold, there is no alternative. And that's why our appeal as AJC is, and a lot of people find this lame or undecided, but we have appealed on numerous occasions also in this campaign cycle on all democratic parties to find solutions for the pressing issues and to find a middle ground. And this is what we will continue to do, and also will try to continue to then bring together people from different parties to debate these issues and give, these conversations a platform and do what we can do in order to facilitate such discussions, and hopefully by that have a healthier culture of debate and a healthier political culture.
Thank you so much, Remko.
Thank you.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for the second installment of our two-part series on the faces behind anti-Semitism as part of AJC's State of Anti-Semitism in America 2024 report. I asked two Jewish college students about the report's findings that nearly a third of Jewish students in the U.S. reported feeling uncomfortable or unsafe at a campus event because of their Jewish identity. Our guests shared their own experience. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.